First of all, to say that the Irish are especially fond of alcohol is to ignore the entire history of every culture in the world from the dawn of time. For example, in America, some people might be drinking tonight, and some of those people might not be Irish. The Aztecs... the Aztecs, untroubled culturally by Eurasia, made a liquor called octli, which is called pulque in Mexico these days. All right. And by all accounts, it is completely disgusting, and yet people still drink it. The idea that the Irish are especially boozy is really more centered on anti-Irish racism, back when racism was really a fine-toothed comb. We despised these red-haired people and their merry jigs, as opposed to now, when we despise much more reasonable things like epicanthic folds and religions that are very slightly different from our own. The other issue with the fairies caused by hooch idea is that, well, I have, in my 43 years, gotten drunk over 6 times. And I know like 4 people who have also gotten drunk over 6 times. And not one of us, during any of these incidents, has at any time observed any kind of sorcery midget. We have observed normal-sized people who we believe to be considerably more attracted to us than they really were, but these people were in fact real, and we had merely taken their studied efforts to ignore us as brazen flirtation. Alcohol is not a hallucinogen, is my point, and I find the claims that it is to be troubling and bizarro. And so we are left with the Irish propensity for wee folk unexplained by their relative number of winos. Presumably it is for mythological reasons that correspond to the Australian love for giant mythical serpents, or all of the Egyptian gods with crazy heads, and that reason is, I don't know. Of course, the most famous of the Irish fae is the leprechaun, with which everyone is familiar thanks to the 2000 film Leprechaun in the Hood. And I do mean everyone is familiar with this. Newborn babes in places that have never had electricity know about Leprechaun in the Hood. They know it in their bones, by instinct, by collective unconscious. Leprechaun in the Hood is part of what it means to be human. As such, I will not trouble you with a recounting of its content, but merely remind you that it starred Ice-T, who in a previous unrelated film played an angry kangaroo, and Julio, who would later star in the movie Pterodactyl, which is the highest grossing film of all time in an alternate universe, where I will add convoy singer C.W. McCall is the current US president. I will also mention that Leprechaun in the Hood featured the titular leprechaun, played by famed Ewok performer Warwick Davis, rapping. I don't have a joke for that. It's sort of a black hole. Less well known than all of this is the fact that Leprechaun in the Hood is in fact the 5th in a series currently numbering 7 films, including Leprechaun 2, Back to the Hood, in which the 2 is a number and the "the" is spelled with an A because it's down with the hard street life. There's also a reboot, Leprechaun Origins, and of course Leprechaun 4 in Space, which is maybe not so believable. In this series, the leprechaun is a terrifying murderer, a slasher with supernatural powers, like an absurd Freddy Krueger. Like a more absurd Freddy Krueger. This is usually for reasons having to do with his purloined gold, but occasionally for reasons to do with his desire for a mate, so that there can be more sexy material in your horror film about leprechauns because you demanded it. Altogether more innocent is Lucky, the cartoon spokesperson for Lucky Charms cereal. Like evil Warwick Davis, he is primarily concerned with the defense of his pot o' gold, or other variable kitchenware o' gold, although in his case it is usually a pot o' breakfast food. Said breakfast food is particularly well known for its thematic marshmallows, its pink hearts, yellow moons, and so on. What is less well known is that each of these marshmallows has an associated magical power in the surprisingly rich body of lore that has sprung up around Lucky Charms. As such, the shooting stars confer flight, the moons invisibility, the rainbows allow teleportation, and the balloons allow things to float. Horseshoes allow for super speed, and clovers for luck. Hourglasses permit the controlling of time, and by extrapolation, therefore, all of reality itself, which you'd think would give you bigger concerns than protecting your breakfast from children, but then breakfast is delicious. Finally, hearts, according to the given lore, give the power to bring things to life, which of course challenges God himself and demonstrates the mad hubris of Lucky the cartoon leprechaun. It is unrecorded whether the pink heart allows the dead to join us once again in the land of the living, or whether it merely animates their corpses in a hollow mockery of life, and if the latter, whether they're slow zombies or fast zombies. Of course, bring all these marshmallow charms together and you can forge the Lucky Charms Gauntlet, by which means the mad titan Thanos might challenge the galaxy itself. That was a joke for Marvel Comics fans. You're welcome. All of this defense of treasure is in fact accurate to the old Irish folktales. Humans are constantly capturing leprechauns in these and demanding their gold, often with threats of horrific violence. Happily, they are uniformly outwitted by the small persons by any of a number of means. Or alternately, the leprechaun just turns invisible and runs off, which is not exactly a triumph of cleverness, but is how I would solve every single problem I have if I could do so. In one story, a farmer captures a leprechaun and locks him in a trunk, which he opens every 7 years to demand gold, only to have the leprechaun rebuff him and also laugh at his misfortunes. Which may seem like a tedious and ineffective way to make money, but then what's your job? Speaking of jobs, the other thing that is extremely common in leprechaun tales is that they are shoemakers. The origin of this idea is unknown. It is possible that the Irish in the olden days invented a shoe-creating creature because they couldn't rationally explain where shoes came from otherwise. Which seems far-fetched, but then people got pretty confused in the olden days. Shoemaking was not, incidentally, used to explain the leprechaun's great wealth. They may have believed in magical tiny millionaires who were into footwear, but making money off of shoemaking is, of course, ridiculous. But outside of being small, shoe-happy plutocrats with superpowers, there is not a lot consistent about the descriptions of leprechauns. They're anywhere from 6 inches to 3 feet in height. They're into tobacco, or whiskey, or both, or neither. They're clad in green or red with an apron, or an overcoat, or an Elizabethan ruff. Their stockings are red or blue. They were super into describing leprechauns' clothing in those days, because they didn't have Nintendos. This variance is more or less typical of the stories of mythical entities. Beyond a few definitive traits, descriptions will often vary wildly. These are creatures of stories, after all, and between storytellers being individually creative sorts and also humans being bad at remembering anything, things are going to change. This is only the more true for stories about fairies. These are entities that by their nature are chaotic, tricky, often shape changers. Leprechauns can be into shoemaking, or breakfast cereal, or grisly homicide, and the only real difference between these stories is that some of them are older. So if you're at a Renaissance festival and someone tells you that they know what fairies really are, and in my experience that is only a matter of time, then I would advise sighing heavily or punching them in the face, depending on your preferred problem-solving techniques. A case in point of this principle is the Irish clurachaun, which is either another name for leprechaun or a different creature entirely, depending on who you consult. As a separate species, it does closely resemble the leprechaun, being small, often dressed similarly, albeit with a tall cap, and sometimes even possessed of a pot of gold. Being a small, weird fairy in old Ireland was nice work if you could get it. Rather than living a life of shoes and suffering attempted burglary all the time, however, what clurachauns were into was drinking. They lived in wine cellars and the like, taking just a bit for themselves and defending the store from unscrupulous house servants. This I'm not making up. In one tale, a clurachaun wakes such a servant up at night and drags her down the stairs. Every time the servant's head hit a stair, the clurachaun would recite, Molly Jones, potato skins and herringbones. I'll knock your head against the stones, Molly Jones, Molly Jones. On every step. Presumably he dragged her down rather slowly. So, watch it, servants. Of course, not all Irish fae are small and rotund and weird. Some are small and thin and weird, or alternately tall and thin and weird. I speak, of course, of a people nearly as famous as the leprechauns, at least to huge nerds, so all you people who have come to a gaming center on the evening of St. Patrick's Day, bear with me. I speak, of course, of the she, spelled like this. Now, this is Gaelic, and whoever it was that assigned the Roman alphabet to Gaelic words appears to have believed the system by which written letters correspond to spoken sounds, regarded by most as really the whole point of written letters, was at best a guideline, or at worst, oppressive. The fact that she starts with an S and ends with an E is more or less coincidence. The she were noble elves, slim and regal, sometimes tiny and sometimes tall. Their influence may be seen in the modern day in the elves of Tolkien, who were drawn from such legends and similar English, Scottish, and Scandinavian ones. And, like the modern elves, the she could multi-class as fighter magic users. They themselves were preceded by the Tuatha De Danann, the mythic first people of Ireland. These were tall and strong and beautiful and fair, and they fought the Fomorians, who were twisted, misshapen giants. These stories serve to remind us all that we should feel better about physically attractive people than unattractive ones. And thank you, I am always forgetting that. Though one may as well mention that the deformity of many of the Fomorians, who varied even in the same stories, that variation was part of their thing, was that some of them had animal heads. And these days there's of course a whole community of people built around sexual attraction to pretty much exactly that. I am not going to speak their name, lest they be summoned. There were a couple different species of she. The default was the Dwynni she, represented here by various famous actors, the people of the mounds. They lived under hills, or on magical islands, or in a world of their own, accessible by paths under the hills, or by other means, or somewhere. For the most part, they kept to themselves, but occasionally they stole humans away to live with them. You were not to eat their food when in their realm, or they would never bring you back. And when they did bring you back, you would find that years had passed on Earth while you were away for what seemed to you to be just moments. Some have compared this to the effects of traveling at near the speed of light, which demonstrates that the she were traveling at the speed of light. In fact, there is a whole school of thought, and I use the words both school and thought loosely, that fairy stories describe ancient encounters with literal extraterrestrials, which explains all the shoemaking and the iron allergy, or no, it doesn't explain them at all. Speaking of the she's vulnerability to iron, this is but one of the ways to irritate such a fairy. They also despise salt, crosses, electricity, and untidiness. It is important not to walk on their hills or on their fairy circles, or to leave something in their fairy paths, or to cut down a thorn bush, or to praise anybody without also saying, God bless him or her. The she had some rules. People get unfairly impatient with folks with gluten intolerance, but that is nothing on the she. Still, if you played along, they were decent enough folks. In one story, an old woman moves into a supposedly haunted cottage and is soon visited by a she who asks to borrow some oatmeal. Some of the old stories were more epic than others. The old woman gave her some and refused repayment a few days later. Impressed by this, the she replied, "As long as you don't open the back door, then you can live here as long as you like. I promise we won't bother you." And then something almost inconceivable in the annals of folklore happened. The old woman never ever did open the back door, and lived the rest of her life in comfort and happiness. Unbelievable. Of course, usually our protagonist would open the door and be whisked off to fairyland, or turned into a mouse, or shot into the sun. But once, just once, the storytellers thought they'd try positive reinforcement. And this was obviously immediately abandoned. But the she were so well known to the Irish that there were several individuals of note and celebrity. Their Queen Maeve, or some other name, was so beautiful that it was dangerous to look upon her. Another she, Willie Rua, received the first drops of any batch of whiskey. Another, Stroke Lad, I immediately stopped researching as soon as I read his name. Another species of she was the Leonin she, or fairy lover. These were beautiful women, gorgeous beyond compare, who would attach themselves to artists and inspire them to ever greater creative glory, all the while draining from them their very lives, their vital essence, presumably to feed to the Skeksis Emperor. There's really not a lot more to the Leonin she, and obviously this is a lot of misogynist garbage. Though if you would really like to study folklore and mythology without encountering a lot of misogynist garbage, boy do I have a little surprise for you. The third kind is the Banshee, or Banshee, the famous screaming spectral women whose cries would portend death, often of people from specific families to whom individual banshees were connected. Now, banshees are often thought of as ghosts, though it is infrequent for anyone to mention ghosts of whom specifically. But then she is right there in their name, and there's a great deal of crossover between the realms of fairy and the dead. Both live in their own lands, both are often semi-solid in this land, and most importantly, both are weird, and people tend to lump together their weirdness. Which is why Bigfoot sometimes comes out of UFOs, which I'm not making up. Somebody else is, presumably. And so the she can be a bit difficult to be around. And I've not even mentioned one of their most trying habits, that of stealing human babies and replacing them with fairies, sometimes baby fairies and sometimes withered old ones. These imposter babies were called changelings. Presumably this was all a folkloric explanation for various real baby illnesses, but whatever the cause of it, there were, luckily, things you could do about it. You could prevent the she entirely from stealing your baby by hanging a scissors over your baby's bed, which may sound like a bad idea, but it's fine. Babies love scissors. Also, children who were praised too much ran an increased risk of fairy kidnapping, so be sure not to do that. If you suspected that your babe had already been exchanged, then, well, here too were remedies. You could, for example, put the baby on a shovel and then put that shovel on the fire while repeating the words, burn, 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 if of the devil burn, but if of God and the saints be safe from harm. At this, if the baby was a changeling, it would rush up out of the chimney. If it were human, then, well, this is unrecorded, but presumably the baby would not go up the chimney and therefore suffer severe burns. Another helpful home tip was that you could tell a changeling by simply beating it unceasingly until its cries brought the fairies to reclaim it. And if it's not a fairy, then, well. Great ideas, you guys. Thanks for checking in. Though it is generally a good idea to follow rules relating to supernatural creatures to the letter, I feel that here's a rare case where improvisation might be acceptable. What we have learned is that if you suspect your baby to be a changeling, simply torture it to within inches of its life. The discipline of pediatrics was very different in old Ireland. Possibly easier. Possibly much, much more difficult. The Irish don't believe in the little people like they used to. Many are sad about this. With the departure of fairies from the world, so too disappears a good deal of the magic that there once was in the world. And also, apparently, a good deal of the extortion, imprisonment, savage beatings, and really unspeakable child abuse. I'm going to call it a wash. Thank you.
Matt Tesser, ladies and gentlemen.